just hit the jackpot with the Everything Geek podcast.
Hello everyone, you're listening to the Everything Geek podcast. I'm your host Rory, and joining me today is a very special guest. We have author Bonansinga, who is best known as the co-author of the Walking Dead novels Rise of the Governor, The Road to Woodbury, The Fall of the Governor, and Descent. So how are you today, Jay?
I'm well, thank you. It's wonderful to be on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you join us, especially with Descent, of course, coming up very soon. Next week, I believe, is it? A couple of weeks from now.
Yeah, the 14th, officially. But you know what? They're sort of like magazines. They usually come out a week or two before the pub date. So, yeah, next week, you'll start to see them floating around.
Yeah, and hopefully not too long after until it makes its way over the pond to me. Yeah.
Right. Well, I've seen the whole, the British editions. I love the British publisher, and I'm not just saying that to be self-serving and blow smoke. I really do. Tor does a great job in there. They have a different package. They always have different graphics for the jacket, the book jacket and stuff, and they're really good. I'm fortunate enough to have been in this business a long time. I've had I had roughly 20 books published before I started with The Walking Dead about 5 years ago, and I've been fortunate enough to have my books translated and published in foreign editions, and there's usually a British edition, and I've even been over there to do publicity on a few of them. I had a book with Pan Macmillan called Oblivion that I was really proud of. It's one of my straight horror novels. But I'm digressing. I apologize.
No, that's fine. I mean, that's really great, that you've gotten to come over to places like Britain and all and do publicity and all that for books you've worked on. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I love the UK. I mean, again, it sounds really fake and bogus, and like I'm giving lip service, but I really do. I was just talking to a Brit about this the other night. I feel like I could live there. I just love the culture. I love, putting in a hard day's work and then stopping at the pub on the way home. I could very easily fall right into that working class culture. I love it.
Yeah, that's great. So getting right into the questions, Jay, my first question for you is, how did you decide you wanted to become an author, how to write books and novels?
I get asked this occasionally, and I have to confess that it probably goes back to the day that I first laid eyes on Rod Serling on television. Rod Serling, for those listeners who might not remember him, because I'm going to date myself probably several times during our chat, which I always do. But, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And Rod Serling was the host of a show called The Twilight Zone. And he was the most badass, cool-looking dude I had ever seen. The first time I saw him walk out with his black suit and, skinny tie and thin lapels, and he's smoking a cigarette, and he's got that Kennedy-esque hair, and he's got that great, rich, stentorian voice. I wanted to be that guy. I wanted to be whatever he was. I mean, I didn't even know at that moment that he was a writer. But as soon as I found out that he was a writer, and a really good one, an award-winning writer, that's what I wanted to do. And I've wanted to be a writer ever since. I'm very lucky that I got to do as an adult what I always wanted to do as a child. But it had nothing to do with writing. It had to do with clothes, is what I'm saying, Rory.
Yeah. That's pretty interesting, though, the way you got into writing because of something else that you've been following up. That is pretty interesting. Yeah. So, moving on to my second question, how did you first get involved with the Walking Dead novels?
Well, I really was a beneficiary of a classic kind of Hollywood, confluence of events or coming together of two artists, because it was literally the old cliche. My manager is a buddy of Kirkman's manager, and Kirkman's producer and slash manager is a guy named David Albert, and he said to my manager Andy Cohen one day, we're looking for a novelist. You know anybody? You know any novelists? You hang out with novelists, don't you, Andy? And he's like, what kind? And they said, well, preferably a horror novelist. We're thinking about, moving the franchise into prose, into, literary realms. And, so the minute Andy called, I wanted to do it, and it sounded juicy and fun and sounded like something I should do, but I had no idea what it really was. I mean, I had read a couple of issues of the comic book at that moment. This was about 2009, like late 2009. And the show had not come out yet. The show had not premiered on television. There was no video game. It was basically just a comic. And, I figured, well, it's certainly going to be like a novelization gig. It'll be, I'll get a script, and they'll just want me to novelize a script. Which is, I have nothing against that. I've done that in the past, and it's decent, honest work for a novelist, but it's not considered, the highest echelon of creativity. Basically, you're just sort of filling in the blanks of a screenplay or a teleplay or a video game script for a successful franchise, and then, they can just sort of benefit from it in another market. But luckily, flash forward, I get the job, and I think there were reasons I got the job. I think I wanted it more and more, and I kept calling Andy back and saying stuff like, because there were like 4 or 5 other authors vying for it, but I kept saying, all right, tell Kirkman that I have George Romero's number on my speed dial. Just tell him that. George Romero is a friend of mine. See if that makes any difference. Which was true. I worked with Romero. Maybe that had something to do with it. But when I finally got the job, and the first time I talked to Kirkman, I said, so you're going to send me a script? And he said, no. That's not what this is. This is these are going to be full-blown, original, serious novels. And I was like, really? And, hence this amazing experience began in earnest. I mean, the first novel, as you mentioned in the setup, was The Rise of the Governor. And, it was an incredible experience just to get inside the head of this character and, go through these permutations from, the sort of kind of arch villain of the comic book and try to put, flesh it out a little bit, put flesh on the bones, and it was just really fascinating. And that's way more information than you probably even wanted, but there you go.
No, I'm always looking for a lot of information. It's not a good story otherwise. Yeah. And seeing as you're
don't worry,
of course, all of a good story.
Well, it's really, a huge part of my life, my career, my creative life, and my passion. Once I heard I was vying for this job, obviously, I went out and I read everything I could possibly get my hands on. I read all the issues of the comic. I read everything I could find, and the more I read, the more I loved it. And I loved the comic. I fell in love with the whole mythology, and it's been going strong ever since. I think it was only up to about 80 or 90 issues at that point. But, it's a fabulous source for the franchise and all the whole industry that's grown up. The comic book still is just sturdy and venerable and continues to delight people, I think.
Definitely, I completely agree. So moving on to my third question, what is it like working with Robert Kirkman?
Well, in a weird way, he reminds me a lot of Romero. Because I worked with Romero on a project called The Black Mariah, and this was back in 1992. And it was one of the films that George Romero got involved with and developed, and he even co-wrote the screenplay with myself and another guy. And it never got made into a movie. It went into turnaround, as they say in Hollywood. But it was really one of the great experiences in my career. And it was eerie. It was almost spooky when I started working with Robert, because he reminded me so much of Romero. They're both physically similar. They're big sort of bears with beards, and they look like, they could chop down a tree. They're both sort of from the Midwest. Romero from the working class northern part of the Midwest, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Robert Kirkman from the middle South of the United States. Richmond, Kentucky is where he grew up. And they both were very sort of uniquely down to earth. They didn't, neither one of them suffers fools well. They just want to get the job done and then go home, and have dinner with their family. They just are really no-nonsense people, and I really enjoy working with both of them. Robert also, he's really got a sort of just a bone-dry sense of humor, and he's funny. I mean, he's funny in a very droll kind of way, which comes out in his writing, I think. One more thing I'll say without rambling on too much about this. Robert has a reputation for like all really successful artists. And he's primarily a comic book writer. I mean, yes, he's the executive producer and creator of the show, along with Frank Darabont and various, the showrunners that have been involved. And he's, in charge of all the mediums, really. He oversees everything. But he's really, at his core, a comic book writer. And he's very, very generous in terms of how he talks about his collaborators in the media. He has mentioned, numerous times that, Jay basically writes these novels. I just sort of, look at him when he's done. And he's very, really generous about that. The first 4 books, it was supposed to be 3, but then the third book, The Fall of the Governor, became a 2-part, 2-volume book. The first 4 books, Robert would give me an outline at the beginning of the process on each book. And it was only, like 8 or 10 pages. And it was in Robert's typical inimitable style. He would just go, all right, Jay, here's how it goes. The characters start here, and then this happens, and then there's a bunch of blood, and somebody dies a horrible ghastly death. You'll figure it out. And then they move to the next city, and it's sort of like that, elemental, or, that sort of sparse. And then finally, after The Fall of the Governor, we were sort of off the comic book page. We had sort of gone to a point in the novels where we kind of reached the end of what's in the comic book in terms of Woodbury and Lily Call and the people that the novels have sort of revolved around, Bob Stuckey, these characters. So Robert, and again, being so, cool with his collaborators, he just said to me, Jay, why don't you, the next contract we have is for 4 more books. Why don't you just basically write the 4 books? I'll just take a look at them when you're done. I may not say anything, but why don't you just come up with the plots and write the books on your own? I remember saying to him, at one point, Robert, you have a reputation, in the business for being kind of difficult, kind of a dick. And I don't find that's true at all. You're like a pussycat. You're like easy to work with. And it's just a slighted pause. And he says, well, if I didn't like what you were doing, I'd be the biggest dick you've ever worked with.
Yeah.
So I think it's just all about Robert Kirkman.
Yeah. So it's just as well you did a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Knock on wood, I keep it up.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I mean, especially with you pretty much, as you were saying, you're pretty much, doing it on your own. Now, of course, he's going to look over and approve at the end, but now you have a bit more control over these next 4 that you did with the previous 4. Would I be right in saying that?
Well, I think I do. And, for a while I was a little nervous. I was like, wow, I got the keys to the family car. I better, be careful. I better look both ways. I better stop at, come to a complete stop at stop signs. I'm thinking, but now that I've finished one and it's coming out, and I'm starting on the next one, I feel like an actor. This may sound strange, but I feel like an actor that has slipped into a role, and they are playing the role in numerous sequels and, series, each week or each month or each year, another one comes out. I feel like an actor that's kind of slipped into Robert's mythology, and I feel like I've absorbed it on some kind of strange cellular level. Because in the early days, I would say, hey, I got a great idea. What if we see this next scene through the point of view of a zombie? And it'll be like strange and trippy. And Robert's like, no. Good idea, though. Excellent idea. But no, we don't do that in The Walking Dead. Okay, and I was constantly like, that reminds me, actually, do you have time for one quick, funny side story?
Yes, we have time for all funny side stories.
Okay. One day, a couple of years ago, I think it was on Rise of the Governor, but it might have been on The Road to Woodbury, the second book. But at one point, the manuscript was done, and the British publisher is preparing to publish it in the UK, and the British editor. I won't mention any names. Not that I have something bad to say about them, but I won't mention any names. The British editor sends an email to Macmillan, the American publisher, and they're supposed to, pass it on to us, Robert and myself. And it says, I notice on page 57. There's reference to a bunch of undead walkers being inside a church together for many months. And I'm just wondering, wouldn't they eat themselves? And I was like, for a minute, I kind of chuckled. And then I'm like, wait, oh my God, did I screw up? Did I mess up here? Oh my God. And I started freaking out. Like, did I make a huge mistake? And of course, Robert doesn't get involved in a lot of this stuff. He's so busy. He's the rock star. He's, we didn't hear from Robert for like weeks. And I got back to him and I said, I'm not sure. I don't think that happens. I don't think it happens in the Walking Dead mythology, most importantly, but I don't think it happens in Romero's, in Romero's world, his milieu, I don't think that stuff like that occurs. They sort of, they don't go for dead flesh. But I'm going to have to defer this to Robert, and we're waiting, like weeks go by. It's like 2 or 3 weeks go by. Finally, this little email comes through from Robert Kirkman, copied to everybody in the loop. And all it says is like one sentence. It says, "Zombies don't eat each other. Next question."
Well, that took care of that pretty quickly. Yeah. Sounds like Robert Kirkman. It's an answer without an explanation, so to speak.
Before I started working with Kirkman, I harbored many of the same sort of I don't know what you would call them, beliefs, philosophies, just sort of norms and mores of zombies.
A good word. Yeah.
Because, Robert is sort of a Romero zombie guy. He's not against fast-moving zombies. He'll tell you, well, look, the fast-moving zombie is scary, and fine, just so it's scary. But I think in his heart of hearts, he's the slow-moving zombie type of guy. And I was before I started working with him. And now that I work with him, and his zombies, especially the Greg Nicotero zombies that are portrayed on the television series, those are strictly Romero-esque zombies. In fact, they're almost more Romero-esque than Romero's. They almost go back beyond Romero into the EC comics, like Bernie Wrightson type of zombies, which I love. And I tell people in interviews, and I get asked this occasionally, fast-moving or slow-moving. I am strictly a slow-moving zombie guy. I don't think the metaphor itself works quite as well with a fast-moving, I love 28 Days Later, and, I love Danny Boyle. I think World War Z, the movie, was even entertaining, but I don't think those are zombies, those creatures. They're different. They're monsters. They're not the archetype that I work with in the books, because I think it only works if you can pretty much outrun it. If you're fast enough, you can. If you haven't, you do enough cardio, and you're in good enough shape, you can pretty much outrun a zombie, or block it out of your home with a few, good, sturdy pieces of 2x4 plywood, But like every incessant problem in life, like a small lump under your skin, like a one missed rent check, like 1 degree in your credit rating, some little small incessant problem, if it gangs up, if it swarms, if several months go by with, delinquent bills, or the lump is malignant, it can destroy you. It can cause mayhem, just like a horde of these slow-moving zombies can. And I think that's how the metaphor works for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. Like, I always see it as more, in the Walking Dead, really, world with slow-moving zombies, if they're gonna get you, it's gonna be a gang of them rather than just a sole zombie, because you can easily, kind of get away, kill, whatever, one zombie if it's on its own. But if you're against a group of them, then you're better off just trying to escape than trying to fight them off.
Exactly. Well put. I mean, the way I look at it is it allows you to create set pieces, that are kind of fascinating, because if a slow-moving zombie can surprise you, it can pop out of some place you didn't expect it to pop out of, or they can fall through a ceiling that collapses or something and land on you. There's great bits of business, so to speak, that you can do with them on the page or on screen, and which actually is probably, a part and parcel with the fact that they are a creation of movies, not of the page. Like some of the great horror archetypes, vampires, man-made monsters, you name it, werewolves. They're the creation of literature. They originally came from, let's say like the Victorian novel. But zombies, the Romero-esque zombie, not the, the Haitian, somnambulant zombie, but the Romero zombie, the crawling out of the graves, in rampaging in the shopping mall, that's a creation of motion pictures. And I think that's one reason why you can't think of a zombie literature classic. We really don't have a Dracula in this subgenre.
Yeah, I completely agree. Moving on to my fourth question, which were your favorite characters to write about in the Walking Dead novels, if you had to choose?
Well, I used to. That's a good question, because when I first started out, I had a very sort of adolescent longing to write about Michonne. Michonne was the, ultimate badass, hardcore, tough as nails woman. And, the ninja, take no prisoners. And she was mysterious. And, the way she's introduced in both the comic book and the television show is super cinematic and kick ass. Just an amazing sort of walk on where she appears with her, kente sword and her, her pets with their, jaws removed. So I longed to write about her. Now, eventually I did get the opportunity, and I wrote about her in both The Fall of the Governor Part 1 and The Fall of the Governor Part 2. And it was really fun. And, Robert Kirkland even called me one day before I started on those books, and he said, "Good news." I'm like, "What?" He goes, I thought he was going to say, "I'm going to give you a raise." But no, he said, anytime your boss says good news, you think you're going to get a raise. And he said, "You're going to get to write Michonne, finally." I'm like, "Oh my God, that's sweet." But the reason I bring all this up as sort of a preamble is I have sort of fallen for Lily Call as probably the greatest character and most fascinating character I've ever written as a writer. She continues to evolve in really interesting ways, and she's sort of taken on a sort of a life of her own. As I think readers of Descent and the next book after Descent, which I'm just starting on now, which I think, here's a scoop for you, I think it's going to be called Invasion. She just becomes...
Yay, free scoop.
Yeah, there you go. That's just from me to you, Rory. That's a little gift. Nobody knows that. I mean, that's brand new. I haven't tweeted that or anything. It's just, and it's sort of not completely decided yet. Robert hasn't written off on that yet, but that may be what it's called.
It's like a provisional title.
Right. Right. But but Lily is, she's an amalgamation of, many character traits that I admire in a character. She's complex. She has flaws, and yet she's the first one to dive into a swarm of zombies to save a child, or stand up for somebody who's honest in her town. And she's the first one to, run into the burning building. And yet she's riddled with phobias and neuroses. And she's, also she's just beautiful and strong and sexy. And she is kind of modeled after my wife. I have to admit, my wife's name is Jill, and I call her Jilly. And I called her Jilly long before I started writing Lily Call. So, yeah. So anyway, that's another long answer to your simple question.
No, I like that. It's pretty interesting, especially, the whole wife reference. That is pretty cool.
It's funny because there's the American edition of The Fall of the Governor Part 2. The hardcover edition, and the trade paperbacks, they have this woman on the cover who's obviously Lily Call, and she's kind of standing there with her back to us as we look, over her shoulder at this, sort of ravaged town, and she's got like a 9mm Glock in her hand, and she looks like she's either just, wiped up the streets, or she's about ready to, take down, a dozen, Walking Dead. And just her shape, just the way she's shaped and her posture and everything looks exactly like my wife.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting.
So anyway, yeah. And yeah. Jilly comes to the conventions with me, and she revels in it. She loves The Walking Dead. She's a big fan of the show. She reads all the books, obviously, because I force her to. I stand over her as she's reading it. And no, I'm just kidding. But she owns it. She's proud. And Lily, the character of Lily Call, has actually appeared in the show in season 4 under a different sort of guise, which really speaks to. I think of it as the calculus of Robert Kirkman's experimentations in all the genres. There's kind of a strange, unique calculus going on where many characters appear. They'll cross over from one genre to another. They'll come from the comic book and then they'll appear in the book, or they'll come from the book and they'll appear in the video game. And and then there are characters who are exclusive to each genre. Daryl Dixon exclusive to the show, the TV show. Clementine exclusive to the video game. But they interact with each other, and they interact with crossover characters. And sometimes crossover characters survive in one genre and die in another. So it's truly impossible to really know what's going to happen. And I think that's the whole impetus behind it. I think it's just simply because Kirkman does not want people to second guess, know who's going to die and when, or what's going to happen with any single character.
Definitely, yeah. My 5th question: did yourself and Robert ever discuss what happens to characters that we don't see die in the novels and their fates are left unknown? For example, April and Tara Chalmers, because in The Rise of the Governor, Tara kind of kicks the governor out of the apartment after the incident with Philip. I'll just call it that.
Yeah. That's an excellent question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. To be honest with you, you have hit on the exact sort of prime directive that I have now with these next 4 books, because Robert and I discussed, who is it, where, what part of the mythology, what part of the story in the comic book and in the books have we sort of left? We have sort of departed from. We've left, like the Chalmers sisters, like April and Tara, who have we left, and we really don't know what happened to them. And Robert said, the big question I think in many fans' mind is, whatever happens in Woodbury? What does Lily take over? What happens after, the big confrontation at the prison and the governor is killed? And then, oops, that was a spoiler. I hope I still have to stop myself, but, then what happens in Woodbury? And I said, you know what, that could be the whole arc of these 4 books. It could be just terrifying and interesting and almost like a tiny little sort of mythology unto itself, the Woodbury Chronicles. And Robert's like, you know what, let's do that. That's the only directive from me, just make sure that this sort of tells us what happens in Woodbury after, the fall. So that was, yeah. So your question sort of kind of gets at that. And that was our motivation for these next 4 books.
Yeah. Just saying, but once you've done with Woodbury, you should definitely write books for April and Tara, because they're definitely 2 of my favorite characters in those books. And, I want to find out
really
what happens to them.
I bet you were kind of fascinated by how they were incarnated in the TV series. April Chalmers did not appear in the TV show, but a family appeared who had a daughter named Tara and who had a father who was, dying of emphysema. And so they were kind of an incarnation, but April became Lily Call. Yeah. And, at the time, the governor, if you remember, the governor was on the road and kind of, fell in with them and kind of fell in love with Lily. That was a completely genetically modified version of the Chalmers.
What you may have noticed is that in the TV show, their surname is Chandler, where in the books that you wrote, their surname is Chalmers. So very similar names.
Right. But by design, I think it's a wink and a nod to readers of the book. I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the comic book and in the series, much of the series, these characters have no last names. So even the governor had no last name in the comic book. And so, 5 years ago when I started working on this, I'm like, well, the governor and his brother, Brian, they're going to have a last name. And Robert's like, why? I mean, they don't in the comic book. I'm like, yeah, but in a book, for me, prose, fiction, you almost are obligated to give main characters a last name unless you are really trying to do something stylistic, But I said, let me try, let me try to come. I say he loved. I mean, Robert doesn't get goo-goo-eyed over anything, but he thought Blake.
That would be a Blake sight to see.
That would be a sight. Talking about ghastly horror. But he liked Blake, and I'm like, I'm glad you like that, because I do. I spend way too much time, probably an inordinate amount of time, thinking about last names for characters in my books. Even in my standalone books, in my original books, the character names are really important to me. I admire books where the characters have names that are completely sui generis, completely original, Hannibal Lecter. These names stick with you. They have subtext. They have, meaning beneath the surface, and they have a sound. And I just thought Blake, maybe it was partially a Thomas Harris allusion, or, the influence of Thomas Harris, who's one of my favorite authors. But, going back to, the visionary artist and poet, Blake, but also the sound of it sounds dangerous. It's not Blake. The word Blake sounds like it could cut you. So that became the Blake brothers. And for Lily, another one of the main characters, her last name is Caul, and that in the vernacular, mostly around the South, is the membrane, the amniotic sac that surrounds an unborn child. And, I thought that would be a really cool name for her, because she is kind of born into this heroism, that she gets involved in. And a lot of the characters had no last names like Bob. Bob was, he became a main character, an important supporting character in the comic book. Never had a last name. Stooky was my name that I gave him in the book, and that ended up in the series. A lot of the stuff from the book bleeds into the series. No pun intended. There's a scene in the series with David Morrissey and Andrew Lincoln, and they're sitting down at a table. It's like the first real face-off of the two characters. It's a showdown. There's like a gun underneath the tabletop, and you have no idea what's going to happen. And the governor launches into a story of his wife's death, and that came from my book. That came solely from my book. And, that's one of the most gratifying things, is that everything is fair game in Robert Kirkman's universe. In his writer's room at the show, they're almost like electronic music, composers or DJs. Like, they sample everything. And they sample the Chalmers family, but they may speed it up, they may slow it down, they may just collage it in there strangely, and it's going to be, I can also tell you that maybe this is another scoop, there's going to be a lot more of this coming up in season 5.
Wow, that's pretty, that is pretty interesting. And yeah, I actually think I have to go back and read the books again now that you mentioned the idea with the gun under the table. Which book was that in?
No, that's in the series. It's in the series.
Yeah, but I thought you said that was an idea from you that was put in the series, or something that you.
No, not the actual fact that they were sitting at a table, but it was the anecdote that the governor in the series tells, that David Morrissey tells. He tells an anecdote about the death of his wife. Yeah,
sorry, I got confused there.
That's all right. That's all right. But, when you write this stuff, and then about a year later, you're sitting on your couch with your wife watching a show, and it's echoing something you wrote a year earlier. It's very cool. It's very gratifying.
Exciting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And it'll definitely be great to see more of that in season 5.
Yeah. Well, you will. I happen to know, I'm not allowed to say what it is, but I'm telling you, there's going to be a lot more sampling going on from all the mediums.
So everyone, you've got around 2 weeks until The Walking Dead season 5 premiere. Read all 4 of Jay's books by then. Then you might have an idea which scenes, references books. Yeah. And if not, you're probably going to end up clueless. Yeah. So moving on to my 6th question. What can you tell us about the new novel Descent, which will be out very soon on October 14th?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking. Of course, it's like really my, my first solo effort in the world of The Walking Dead. I almost feel like I feel like akin to Scott Gimble who's the head writer, the showrunner, with the novels. I'm really sort of running the writer's room of the novels, so to speak. And, I've gone through the process on one, and it was probably the best experience I've ever had with a book. I know a book, let me put it this way. I know a book is special, or at least, minimum, I know a book is working if I sit down to proofread it and I get caught up in it. Because I've taught fiction writing over the years occasionally, and I remember, always being flabbergasted by my students when I asked them, have you sat down and read your novel from page 1 to the end straight through? What? Yeah, it's a simple question. Have you sat down and read your own novel from page 1 to the end straight through? They're like, well, no. Who does that?
I would. I love reading novels.
Yeah. Well, I do too. And I think that happened to me on Descent. As I was, proofreading it, and I just really sit down in a quiet place. I go to the graduate stacks at Northwestern University, and I just spend like 8 or 9, 10 hours sometimes. I just go from morning to night on a single day, and I read the whole thing straight through. I have to do that to know if, the rhythm is working, the pacing. You really don't know what to cut out or what to leave in unless you do that. If you read it in fits and starts, it's harder to get a handle on that. And, part of my process personally is I look at writing fiction as similar to writing music. It has to have a beat you can dance to. It has to flow, and it has to sound right to your inner ear, and I just got caught up in Descent. I had, I think it has something to do with the fact that Robert kind of cut me loose from the comic book panels, which that's not to denigrate the comic book, obviously. It's a great, example of that medium. It's one of the greats in graphic novel history, and I love it. But when you're sort of going back to it on a regular basis and keeping the timeline straight and retelling things that have happened in the comic book from a different point of view, you are kind of encumbered, or at least you're sort of tethered to that. And when he cut the tether and just sort of let me loose, like a dog that he had kept in a kennel, and he just lets this dog loose, I mean, I was so excited. And it shows, I think, in the book, the way it reads. There's more cliffhangers. There's more, action. It's just, I really am proud of it. I almost have to temper what I say about it, because many of the fans already know that it's the first solo book. It doesn't follow the comic book anymore. In fact, that we went through this entire. You are the first, and I'm not saying I do a lot of these, but I do quite a few of them. But you're the first interview, the first podcast I've done on this stage of the Walking Dead books, on this new era. So you're getting a lot of scoops. Like, I'm probably, I'm probably speaking out of school in when I say some of these things. But Robert is very cool about being upfront and honest about how these things are created. And, I imbued this one, Descent, with more of my tricks and my bag of tricks and stuff that I know, because I felt emboldened. Robert allowed me to do it, and so, yeah, I could go on and on about this one. It's sort of, it's kind of I would call it horror action. I guess I would have to say it's more horror action, where it tips the scale toward action. which is kind of what I specialize in. The first book I ever published was called The Black Mariah, and it was the book that George Romero attached himself to and adapted with me. And it was basically the story of two itinerant truck drivers, long-distance, long haulers who travel back and forth across the United States delivering, produce, to grocery wholesalers. And in the deep South, late one night, in the dark of night, they come across a hapless individual who's been infected with some kind of illness or sickness, and it turns out it was a curse. And they are infected with the curse, the two truck drivers, and they learn that the curse, an ancient curse, which prevents those infected from coming to a stop. If you become motionless while infected with this curse, you will get violently ill, and if you stay motionless, you'll burst into flames. And so this was, my first attempt at a long-form horror work, and it was all action. They had to refuel themselves while in motion. They had to, anyway, I'm not doing a commercial for my first book, although you can order it on Kindle or any digital format. But yeah, and while we were working on it, I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but while we were working on it, because Descent kind of reminds me of the feel of this piece. It's my firstborn too. I mean, I wrote it in 1990. You hope that you're a better writer, but also there's a love of your firstborn. Transcends everything. I go back and look at it, and I'm like, yeah, it's overwritten. It's very purple. It's very, wordy, but I love it. I love it. Yeah. It's really fun to read.
There's something nostalgic about it.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There is a nostalgic aspect to it. And yeah, I remember when we were working on it one day at Romero's house in Sanibel Island, Florida. His producer was working with us, and the other writer, Preston Whitmore, and I were sitting there, and we were taking notes, and George was going through the story, and the phone rings. And the producer, Peter Grunwald, picks up the phone, and, I hear him talking to somebody, and he goes, nope, haven't heard of it. No, don't know anything about it. What's it called? Nope, I don't know it. I'll have to ask these guys if they've heard of it. All right, I'll talk to you later. Goodbye. And click, he hangs up. And then he looks at us and he goes, there's this project in development over at Paramount. It's called Speed. Has anybody heard of that? And none of us had heard of it at that point. And he goes, well, the bad news is it's about a bus that has a bomb rigged in it that won't allow the bus to come to a stop. And it's an action, vehicle film. I should have known the minute I heard that our project was doomed. We kept working on it. Originally it was on the fast track, at New Line Cinema, and basically within a couple of months it had stalled because of Speed. Speed had beaten us to that perpetual motion movie. So anyway, I mean, again, it's a digression, but that's this is Descent feels like a new chapter in my work, and I hope that people feel that when they read it.
Definitely. I mean, that's obviously pretty exciting. Yeah. So my final question. Yeah. My final question for you, Jay, is: of course, we all know about Descent, which is an upcoming project which is out very soon. But do you have any other upcoming novels or other projects you would like to talk about?
Well, as a matter of fact, when one thing is when you're a career writer and you've been doing this as long as I, and you're fortunate enough to be regularly published internationally, you always have something in the works. It's like a busy airport. There's always ideas that are circling the airport that you have to land sooner or later, and you're kind of in the control tower. So I have had this one idea for a long time, and I've been developing it for years, and it's finally going to come out. It's being published by a small boutique division of Simon & Schuster called Permuted Press, and it's a supernatural horror novel that takes place in the world of dream mechanics, dreams, and it's called Lucid. And it's called Lucid because it's about lucid dreamers, who are, as you probably know, a lucid dreamer is a dreamer who knows they're dreaming when they dream. And because they know they're dreaming for one reason or another, and there's a lot of ways a lucid dreamer can learn that they're dreaming, they control their dreams. So, it's that's kind of the takeoff point. That's where it begins. And and so that comes out in January of 2015.
That's pretty exciting. I mean, it obviously must feel great when it's something you've been working towards for a long time, and it finally gets greenlit, and now you know where it's going to be coming out. That must feel really great.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's doubly sweet for me because I was sort of in the throes of trying to finish it when I got the Walking Dead job 5 years ago. And I got to know the people who produced the Walking Dead series pretty well. It's a company called Circle of Confusion, and they're really cool people, and they develop really cool material. And they asked me what I was working on other than The Walking Dead. What else was I working on? And I told them about Lucid. And they loved it. And, I'm hoping that we can revisit it and go back to it, because maybe they'll get involved with the screen version of it. Who knows? But they were really interested in it. And I knew I had something. So I really kept working on it whenever I had an opportunity, which wasn't very often over the last 5 years, because Kirkman just kept me, sending out these Walking Dead books. And each book would debut on the New York Times bestseller list. And it became a huge priority, and it became a lovely thing. And this is maybe a good way to end our podcast, at least my part of it, by saying that I get asked by people all the time at conventions, on the street, in interviews and stuff, and they ask me similar questions. They always say, "Do you long to go back to your original material ever? Do you miss those days when you were working on your original novels?" And my answer is always the same: not at all. I don't long for that at all. This is this gig that any author has ever had, and I will defend that to my death. I am so lucky to have fallen into this honeypot, the Walking Dead. And really say that sincerely. If anybody familiar with my backlist, with my catalog of stuff that I've written, would understand where I'm coming from, because I feel like I have been working toward this project, this continuing project of working, on the Walking Dead books, my whole life. From the time that I saw, Night of the Living Dead in 1968. I was 9 years old, and I snuck into the theater in Peoria, Illinois, the Palace Theater. And little did I know that when I was bit with that bug back then, I loved it, and I was terrified by it, and I went back to see it immediately. Little did I know that was going to be my destiny. That was a precursor, really, to what I'm doing. And I just people go, well, yeah, but don't you sometimes get frustrated that you're becoming known as like the zombie book guy? And I'm like, no, there's no frustration. I'm proud to be known as anything in this world.
It's a good answer. Yeah. So that's all of our questions for you, Jay. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you on the podcast.
Back at you. Same here, Rory. It's been really fun, and I appreciate you taking the time and giving me this much time. It was really a pleasure.
Yep. And thank you for taking time to talk to us before the release of Descent. And hopefully we can talk to you again at some point, considering I'm sure you have many more Walking Dead novels to come out in the future.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Every time I work out now, every time I go to the gym and work out, I'm like, I got to stay healthy. I got like 10 more Walking Dead books to write in my life. I have to stay. Or maybe if we do have a zombie apocalypse, I'll be able to outrun them.
Yeah, that would be interesting, that's for sure. Yeah. So hopefully we'll talk to you soon then.
I look forward to it, Rory. Thank you again.
Yeah. Talk to you soon then.
All righty.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was a great interview with author Jay Bonansinga, our first author guest on the podcast, who told us quite a bit about The Walking Dead and the upcoming novel Descent, which comes out October 14th. Make sure to buy it or pre-order it online, as Jay suggested. It's going to be great. I mean,